Hey guys, it's Nate from the Bike Company. I want to go over a couple of the real common reasons, particularly on a new shock or on a new bike, that you hear my suspension's losing air. Every time I check it, it's lower, or every time I ride, it's lower. Typically, those aren't based on the suspension actually losing air. There's two ways, particularly with rear shocks, that's most likely. We're going to go over those, and then we'll take a look at a couple things where if it is a little bit older suspension, where you might look to troubleshoot if you are losing air in your mountain bike air suspension. To start out with, the most common air loss is from not pre-charging your pump. Now, there's a small air chamber in here. It's not big relatively compared to a car tire or even your tire in your mountain bike. And when you attach your pump to it, you increase the size of that chamber because the line has to be filled. So when the volume goes up, the pressure goes down. And you're going to see your pump might read 10, 15 below. If it's a super high PSI, it might read further below than that. You could actually drain a shock just hooking up the pump over and over and over. But that's the most common reason that you see, especially newer riders who maybe don't know how to pre-charge a pump, when they say, every time I check my suspension, it's lower. Well, when you put your pump on, thread it on, but before it breaks the Schrader valve, go ahead and pressurize the pump to about what you have in the main chamber. Your goal is to equalize the PSI in the pump line to approximately what's in the main chamber of the shock. And that way you're not going to get a huge spike or movement because of the increase in volume. If this is similar to that, you might see a PSI or two. I doubt you're going to see a ton more than that based on the volume differences, but it's going to be much, much closer to what you're looking for. Particularly if you're, really fine-tuning a setup for like a race weekend, or if it's a new bike and you're working on, getting that bike set up for your preferences. The second cause that's real common of my shock, is losing air. The negative chamber on the rear shock, unlike the fork typically charges at full extension, and then the negative air charges while you're pumping it up, or real close. But typically, you're not going to see this huge dive with the fork because of the way that they're designed. The rear shock's a little different. The air transfer port is further along in the shaft. And what that means, you're actually going to have to cycle the shock a few times for the negative air chamber to charge. Well, in that moment when the positive air chamber hits the bleed divot and charges the negative air chamber, the volume increases, so pressure is going to decrease. I've had this happen. I got in a hurry years ago going on a demo ride, and I forgot to cycle the shock, so it had a great sag, jumped on it in the parking lot, took a few strokes on it. By the time I hit the trails, I'm like, God, it's sitting about 50% instead of 30 or 25. And what it was it had charged the negative air chamber and sat me deeper in the sag. So another common place to look if your shock loses air, particularly, right off the bat. If you're making big swings, PSI here or there, they're really cycling is not going to make too big of a difference. But especially if you're making big swings, from a new unloaded piece of equipment up to your rider weight, that's where it's going to make a lot of difference to your setup. Two other things that are things to look for. What are the condition of your seals? Where are you at in the service life of your suspension? So your seals do wear, and as they age, they can start to lose pressure. The way that I check this is I go ahead and set the shock at a real easy, even number, 100, 150, 200, whatever you want. And I just let it sit for a couple days. And if I come back, I pre-charge my pump, put it on, and the main has gone down notably, well, it's probably time for seals. If the main hasn't gone down notably, well, it still might be time for seals, because it could be something that as the system pressurizes, the seal is losing it at, under more load. So then you want to look at how much dirt has this shock ingressed, what are the hours on the shock, A, B, and C. I'm kind of reticent to dunk test suspension for the most part. I feel like it would have to have such a bleed that you would probably notice it with either the test with it sitting. I suppose some part of me is like, I don't want water in my shock, but I guess if the water got in, I would have to rebuild it anyway because it was be bleeding air. So, yeah, maybe my concern on that isn't as reasonable, but that's kind of where I would go. I would be leaning on the does it hold pressure test first. One other thing on seals, don't use any like DIY internet. This makes my shock so slippery concoctions. Okay, there's a lot of chemicals out there. Anything with a high pH or whatever will eat rubber seals, and you don't want your seals degrading any faster than they need to. So, just a piece of advice: if you're gonna use lube on your stanchions, make sure it's legitimate suspension lube and not something that's going to actually attack your seals. Finally, and this is pretty rare, I've only seen it a couple times in all the years I've been doing this, but if the seals are replaced and you're still having issues, it could be a casting issue. Like I said, really, really rare, hard to see because they're generally micro cracks and they generally only show themselves under some sort of pressure. So you almost need to dyno it and see, like a Windex test almost to see, are you getting air out of there? That's something that's pretty hard to detect in your home garage. So if you've changed the seals and you're still having issues, my 2 cents is to let a professional get in there and see what they see as far as your air loss. And again, are you pre-charging your pump? Did you charge your negative chamber? What condition are your seals in? And that's pretty much going to cover your bases. So we look forward to putting out some more how-tos and then to redo some of our other ones and kind of update the catalog. So keep an eye out at bikeco.com.